Israel has suffered its highest number of military casualties since the war in Gaza began 109 days ago, with 24 Israeli soldiers killed on Monday. This was reportedly the moment when 21 Israeli reservists were killed. They'd planted demolition explosives in two buildings in central Gaza when the explosion happened. IDF spokesperson Daniel Hagari gave these details.
According to what we know at the moment, at around 4 o'clock, an RPG missile was apparently fired by terrorists at a tank that was securing the forces. At the same time, there was an explosion of two-story buildings. The buildings collapsed as a result of the explosion, while most of the forces were inside them, in and near them. The buildings apparently exploded as a result of mines that our forces planted in them in preparation for the process of blowing up the buildings and the terrorist infrastructure.
At the same time an explosion occurred, Hagari is very careful there not to characterize the explosions as the result of actions by Hamas. But the Israeli media has been more blunt. This was how the Jerusalem Post reported those events. Hamas causes buildings to collapse after firing rocket-propelled grenades on multiple adjacent structures. Additionally, a further 3 soldiers were killed in a separate attack by Palestinian fighters on a tank in southern Gaza. So that brings us to 24 Israeli soldiers killed on a single day, which is a real blow to Israel at a time when domestic support for the war is starting to wane. It brings the total number of soldiers lost in the war to at least 217. And because Israel has conscription, those losses are being felt right across civil society. Remember, reservists are not professional soldiers. They are taking the call up after coming from communities, workplaces, and families in which they are embedded. Andreas Krieg is Associate Professor of Security Studies at King's College London. He explained all of that to Al Jazeera regarding the impact of these deaths.
Unfortunately, so far, the Israeli public has somewhat been shielded from the real cost of this war. I mean, the burden of warfare, the operation burden has been shifted by the Israeli military onto the civilian population in Gaza. And what we see now is that as the Israelis are operating in the rear, as this war is kind of coming to a stalemate, it seems that the Israeli armed forces are now extremely vulnerable also for targeting. And it also shows that Hamas has not been defeated, and the cost of war are still there, and they're likely going to rise, and the Israeli public will be ever more exposed to these costs of war. And a single incident such as this in a fairly small country like Israel will have quite a lot of impact on the collective psyche of Israelis, and put pressure on the government to bring this war to an end and potentially accelerate negotiations.
That acceleration may happen, but it hasn't happened yet. In response to killings, Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu made this bullish statement. Yesterday, we experienced one of the most difficult days since the outbreak of the war. The IDF has launched an investigation into the disaster. We must learn the necessary lessons and do everything to preserve the lives of our soldiers. In the name of our heroes, for the sake of our lives, we will not stop fighting until absolute victory. To save lives, we've got to lose 24 soldiers in one day, apparently. Benjamin Netanyahu may be calling for, quote, absolute victory in Gaza, but whether that victory in Israel's own terms can be achieved appears to be increasingly unlikely. Here's Andreas Krieg again.
Does this goal of absolute victory still make sense from a military standpoint?
No, absolutely not. I mean, I've been saying this for over 3 months. There is no military solution to this issue and to this conflict. The root cause is a political one. It's a counterinsurgency operation, has to be seen as such. If they want to defeat Hamas, they need to defeat the movement. They need to do this politically. They need to offer something in return to the Palestinians collectively, not just to Hamas. And from a military point of view, there's literally nothing that can be done. We've seen the complete annihilation of the physical infrastructure of Gaza, and still Hamas is fighting. Still, Hamas has the capability to fire rockets, even if somewhat in a restrained way. But we see Hamas operatives still running around Gaza, still being able to avoid open firefights, appearing and disappearing, shooting from the rear, creating ambushes, and as we've seen in that incident overnight, being able to target Israeli soldiers with impunity and then disappearing again. What we also know from the Israelis is that for the most part, Hamas fighters are avoiding open battles and open firefights, even in the urban environment. And hence why the Israeli numbers of killed soldiers have been fairly low, while the number of wounded soldiers, also severely wounded soldiers, has been quite high, because what we see is that Israeli soldiers are being attacked from the rear in ambushes, booby traps, and this situation is likely going to continue with hundreds of miles of tunnel systems that the Israeli military so far has been unable to destroy and will most likely never be able to destroy. And hence they're in this kind of situation, in an unwinnable war where they can't get out of.
Krieg is absolutely right there about the number of injured Israeli soldiers. In December, the Times of Israel reported this. Israel's rehabilitation hospitals were unprepared for the number of wounded soldiers being admitted. According to an IDF report also in December, over 6,000 members of the Israeli security forces had been injured since the war began, and over 2,000 were classified as suffering permanent disabilities as a result. The true figures are likely to be higher. Again, remember, these are likely to be reservists. Ash, over 200 dead for a conflict which is less than 4 months old. That should have political repercussions for Netanyahu, shouldn't it?
Well, I think one of the things that you've got to understand is that for Netanyahu, there really is no upside. He's having to manage quite a few downsides. One downside is as the war continues, you have more Israeli casualties. That creates pressure. You also have the ongoing issue of the hostages not being released without some kind of negotiated settlement, the negotiation of a permanent ceasefire, and you've got the hostages' families, friends, and loved ones in Israel applying a degree of political pressure to Netanyahu's government. But if Netanyahu were to negotiate a more permanent ceasefire, if he were to bring an end to this war, his political career may well be over. One, he's having to deal with the extreme unpopularity of his Supreme Court reforms. And two, October 7th was seen as very much his security fuck up. The thing that he always promised Israelis was that there'd be no Palestinian state and that he would keep their security interests as the very, very top priority. Now, as me and you have discussed many times on this show before, there is an inherent contradiction there. You cannot keep Israeli civilians safe while denying Palestinians their political rights, their rights to self-determination and their rights to statehood. You simply can't do both those things at once. And I think that broke down spectacularly and irretrievably on October the 7th. But again, I think that could very much, it could spell the end of Netanyahu. So yes, casualty figures like the ones we've seen today of 24 Israeli soldiers being killed in a single day, that does create a pressure for Benjamin Netanyahu. But I don't think that it creates more pressure than his fear that it would be the end of his premiership should the war in Gaza end. And there's one thing that I want to just speak on very, very briefly, and it's this notion of a total victory in Gaza. Now, this is something that you hear an awful lot within the British media as well. This idea that a realizable military objective is the destruction of Hamas in Gaza, the total surrender of Hamas in Gaza. If there's one thing that we learn from the study of history, it's that you pretty much cannot end a native insurgency through military means unless you are willing to carry out a genocide or an ethnic cleansing. Right? You just simply can't do it. It's like breaking a piece of glass. All you do is you create more pieces, because this is a direct consequence of the aforementioned blockade, siege, occupation, conditions of apartheid, the wholesale denial of political rights, self-determination, and sovereignty for the Palestinians. Without that context, you don't get Hamas. You simply don't get Hamas. And if you were living in Gaza, and don't forget, many Hamas fighters are themselves orphans of previous wars on Gaza. If now you're a young person growing up in Gaza, highly likely that people you know will have been killed, highly likely that people you know will have been permanently maimed, mutilated. You've seen the destruction of education facilities, healthcare facilities, power, communications, transport infrastructure. You have been left out in the cold without medicine, without food or adequate water. Do you think that's going to make you more or less likely to want to enact acts of violence against Israel, its military, and indeed its civilians? Not justifying, simply saying, what do you think is realistically more likely? Because if you create circumstances where people have nothing to lose, and in Gaza, they have had nothing to lose apart from their lives, there's no economic opportunities. The Israeli blockade had an absolute stranglehold on Gaza's economic development. That only strengthened Hamas's hand rather than weakened it. And I think that we're seeing the exact same thing now. You're seeing support for Hamas increase across the West Bank occupied territories. And I don't think that this will have broken down the support for Hamas in Gaza, because Israel's indiscriminate campaign of bombing, its war crimes against the Palestinian people, including the war crimes of forcible transfer, and in my view, genocidal acts and ethnic cleansing, all you're doing is making violence against the Israeli state and Israeli civilians inevitable in the future. Absolutely inevitable.
I think it's important to say that. I don't think it's condoning anything. This war is making Israel less safe. This war, which has seen more than 200 Israeli soldiers die so far, thousands of casualties, we think 2,000 life-changing injuries, is making Israel less safe. It's having a massive implications for global trade. It means that the US and the UK are now getting embroiled in a war with Yemen. And it is a war, by the way, if you keep on doing it. Who wins out of this? Who's winning? Not the Gazans, not Israelis, certainly not the IDF, not the Yemenis. Who's winning? Benjamin Netanyahu and his government. Yeah, apparently the entire world apparently has to dance to their tune. And what you were saying there, Ash, really makes me think, there was a video on Instagram rather, of a man holding up his dead newborn child. And of course, millions of people are seeing these images every day. No matter what the extremists say in this country's media or in Westminster, and they are extremists, no matter what they say, if you see something in the palm of your hand, you can't deny it, you can't not see it. He was holding up his newborn child, it was dead, and he said, was this Hamas? Was this Hamas? Of course it wasn't. But we've had thousands of children die since October the 7th. Palestinian children have died. And again, you can look at the sort of more puerile comments on social media. They're more wisdom than 1,001 front pages in our country's newspapers. One of them was this: if you destroy Hamas, but you kill thousands of children, surely you're creating Hamas too. A throwaway, trivializing comment perhaps, but I think it's actually pretty damn accurate. But apparently random people on Instagram and TikTok have more wisdom and sagacity than the people around this country. They do, by the way.